Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. It is 8.5 million acres of nearly pristine Arctic habitat. It's remote and encompasses the majority of the Brooks Range in northern Alaska. The peaks here can rise to a little over 7,000 feet in elevation, and almost all the park's territory is mountainous. Most of the 10 inches of precipitation that falls here yearly is bound in snow, which melts each spring. This flood of water signals the salmon to migrate upstream to spawn their next generation. Brown bears are then drawn to the willow and alder bushes that grow alongside the waterways to fish for those salmon. Animals you might see include black bears, muskoxen, moose, Dall sheep, wolves, wolverines, coyotes, and lynxes. River otters and beavers swim the creeks, and eagles, hawks, and owls patrol the tundra for pikas, ground squirrels, and lemmings. In the Brooks Range Valley, over 500,000 caribou migrate in pursuit of the most nutritious grazing grounds. Reportedly, only 132 brown bears call the park home, which is a density of 1 bear for every 100 square miles. That means your odds are not great to see one, but in the event you do, the disposition of the bear may be your greatest concern. Robert Bell was born in Ithaca, New York, and received his law degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He was part of a team of lawyers at Kay, Scholar, Fearman, Hayes, and Handler that had recently won the largest award granted by a federal jury to that point, of $100 million. He was a brilliant man, but was known for being a caring and genuine person, and described as not your typical lawyer type of person. In the months leading up to August 1996, 42-year-old Bell had been planning a backcountry boating and hiking trip with 2 of his friends in the gates of the Arctic National Park. They charted their route to travel the river system that followed the Noatak River, which flows north and west into the Chukchi Sea. Bell and his friends would float for part of the day, then beach their boat at planned waypoints. This pause in their float would allow them to hike up trails and take in scenery that most people will never get to set their eyes on. They were aiming to start their big adventure on August 19, 1996. Bell's group had brought backpacks and the typical camping gear to prepare food and set up tents, as most people would do. They'd even had the forethought to attach bear bells to their backpacks to let the bears know they were around. Additionally, they planned to talk and make noise as they hiked, just to make sure the bears got the message. They didn't take any firearms, though. Whether it was a matter of the added weight they would have to carry, or simply the lack of expectation of needing one, either way, they chose not to bring them along. The adventure began with energy and excitement, and by Tuesday, August 26th, they had arrived near the confluence of the Noatak and Kugrak Rivers. The location was on their waypoints list, so they beached their boat and gathered their hiking gear to do some exploration. One of the hikers, whom we'll call Sam, decided to stay with the boat and let Bell and their other companion, whom we'll call Mike, go on the hike without him. Bell and Mike spent the better part of the day hiking up the Kugrak River, and after turning around, were on their way back toward their boat. While passing through a patch of 7-foot-tall willows, the men caught sight of a brown bear sow with her cub. They had seen her while still a few hundred yards from her, and had time to discuss navigating around the bears at a safe distance. They planned to make noise as they circled her, so that she would not be alarmed by their presence, and either run away or allow them to pass her. Now, to understand how the men's scents would travel in this environment, we must first discuss the weather. That day there were strong gusts of wind blowing consistently from the north to the south most of the afternoon. Temperatures hovered at just above 40 degrees for the same time frame. There was no precipitation reported in the area, which means that scents would be carried further and in higher concentrations on the breeze. Given the mountainous terrain, scents tend to travel in the same direction as the wind and follow contours like the airflow. If the overall flow of air is along a river drainage, then the scent of the men would tend to travel that same route. A consistent breeze may carry a human scent right past a bear's nose, but even a slight shift could bring the scent directly to the bear. The consistent wind created a noisy rustle that would keep any sound the men could generate from reaching the bear's sense of hearing. Mike decided he would go first and slowly proceeded around the sow and her cub while talking and making noise. It was tense going, and Belle watched from an elevated point to see how the sow reacted as Mike passed by. As Belle watched, he could see the sow lifting her head and sampling the air, but she didn't have an alarmed or aggressive reaction to Mike's presence. This emboldened Belle that his hike around her would go as well as Mike's did. Once he saw Mike wave at him from the far side of the bears, Belle planned to travel the same route and do the same things that Mike did. If it worked for him, it should work fine for Belle too. The only problem with that kind of thinking is that it relies on the predictability of bears. Mike looked on as Belle initiated his turn to pass the bears. He was about halfway through the route and making noise when Mike saw the sow's head lift. She suddenly became very focused on the spot where Belle was making noise. In a split second, the sow became a brown streak that was headed straight for his friend. Mike could hear the willows popping and tossing as the bear blew through them. He next heard Belle yell for help, followed by grunts and growls from the sow. In a matter of seconds, Mike could hear nothing from Belle's location. Not a moan or a shout. Nothing. Mike had no doubts about what had happened to his friend. After his shouts went unanswered, he quickly made his way back to the boat and informed Sam about Belle's fate. The two friends decided to return to the attack site and see if they could recover Belle's body. Once they located his corpse, they knew his death was quick. He didn't struggle very long with the wounds he suffered. They carried Belle's corpse back to the location of their boat to ensure it wasn't consumed by the bears. Now in one of the most remote areas in the world, without a means to reach anyone, the men decided to do the only thing they could do. They worked out a plan to try to signal passing aircraft to summon help. By Saturday, August 31st, the men were flown out alongside Belle's body. Upon examination, Belle was noted to have died instantly from the damage the sow had done to his body. This means that most likely he'd died from a strike or bite to his head or neck, or instantaneous death would not have been likely. Belle's wife, Jody, also an attorney, flew up to Alaska to bring his body home for burial. Following the attack, officials closed off the area to aid in their investigation. They wanted to take a good look at the bear population before allowing people back in the area. After reviewing the circumstances of Belle's fatal bear attack, they decided to take no action against the bear. They deemed the sow's behavior normal for a brown bear protecting her young. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. What triggered the sow to attack Belle, but not Mike? Do you think the noise the men made aggravated the sow? Why on earth didn't these guys pack firearms? Would you have tried to sneak around a sow brown bear and her cub? I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Yellowstone National Park. No, we aren't going to the broad expanses of the Lamar Valley or some backcountry trail too close to a bison carcass. The attack we will be discussing happened at one of the most visited locations in the entire park, Old Faithful Geyser. Yes, the crowds of people that visit the geyser in the peak month of July approach 1 million in number. That comes out to about 30,000 people daily and about 1,000 people each hour. The elevation here is a little over 7,300 feet high, and the rolling granite hills are sparsely covered with pine, fir, and spruce trees. Elk, moose, deer, bison, and antelope are visible from nearly any road in the park, but sometimes cause traffic jams here. The raised boardwalks meander a safe distance away from deceptively tranquil pools of boiling mineralized water. Black bears, cougars, coyotes, and wolves roam this area, but the danger they pose pales in comparison to those grizzly bears present. On Saturday, June 24, 1972, 25-year-old Harry Walker was hitchhiking around the country in a reevaluation of his life. He was traveling with his friend, 29-year-old Philip Bradbury from Oxford, Alabama, who went by the nickname Crow. Harry hailed from Anniston, Alabama, and was a farmer. The men had left 19 days prior and wound up in Yellowstone during its centennial celebration. Upon entering the park, the men were allowed admittance for free because they were on foot and not in a vehicle. The rangers didn't do this for everyone, but allowed Harry and Philip in as a favor. While making their way through the various gates and offices, the men had somehow managed to miss all the literature provided regarding the danger of bears in the park. For the past few decades, there had been a debate brewing among biologists and other scientists about just how the park should be run. In 1943, Olaus Murray had called on authorities to close down dumps that park employees used to dispose of their trash. Bears were known to gather around the dump sites, and at one point 7 grizzlies had been observed at a single dump. Given the total population was below 100 bears at one point, that is a significant percentage of the bear population that were relying on dumps for food. For the 8 decades prior, bears had been allowed to scavenge food from Yellowstone dumps, but conscientious scientists noted that they didn't need them, and it was unnatural. Given this permission and encouragement, bears that otherwise would avoid human contact were trained to tolerate and even seek it out for sustenance. Since the bears were hanging out along the roads, begging for food, many visitors safely ventured into the backcountry, which was nearly void of bears in comparison. By the late 60s, the discussion had reached fever pitch, and 2 camps had formed among the scientists. One camp believed in closing the dumps at once and forcing the bears to go back to natural food sources. The other camp was led by 2 biologists, the Craighead brothers. The Craigheads noticed that closing the dumps too quickly would force human-dependent bears to invade campgrounds in search of food. They proposed that road-killed carcasses of deer, elk, and bison be helicoptered into the backcountry to lure the bears away from the dumps. The dumps could then be closed slowly so that lingering bears would follow their noses to feed on carcasses and away from campgrounds. The Craighead brothers summarized their proposal in a 113-page report and delivered it to Yellowstone Superintendent John McLaughlin in 1967. In the same year, a spat of grizzly bear maulings and human fatalities occurred in Glacier National Park and became known as the Night of the Grizzlies. 2 women were killed by bears habituated to eating from dumps near ranger stations. The potential of having a similar occurrence in Yellowstone prompted McLaughlin to order an immediate and sudden closure of all dumps in the park. Visitors to the park were not provided bear-proof dumpsters at this time and weren't particularly afraid of having bears come into their camps. After all, only a few years prior, they were allowed to hand-feed bears along the roadsides. Their perception of bears was that they were harmless and wouldn't hurt you, even if they did eat all of your food. Grizzlies being grizzlies, the closure of the dumps caused an enormous uptick in bear attacks and hostility. The rangers were charged with protecting the public, so the problem bears were shot, reducing an already low population to near extinction. In 1970, 57 grizzlies were killed by people, and only 5 years later, just 136 grizzlies remained. This brings us back to Harry and Philip's visit to the park. The men had decided to camp at Old Faithful Geyser at an unauthorized campsite. Rangers knew that many visitors were illegally camping but overlooked it, neglecting to enforce the laws due to the experience people were having. They pitched their camp only a few hundred feet from the boardwalk behind a screen of lodgepole pines. They could easily walk to the creek for water from there and only had to worry about the rangers chasing them out. Just behind their campsite, a thick growth of smaller trees screened anything hiding within it from view. Since the park authorities failed to notify the public of the dumping ground closures, the men were unaware of the danger they were in. What Harry and Philip didn't know was that a sow that lived in the area had been known as a problem bear. The ranges had coordinated her relocation previously, but she'd always found her way back. She was a regular at the dump behind the Rabbit Creek Ranger Station, which was closed, and now she was looking for a new food source. The Craighead brothers had conducted a 10-year study on the grizzlies in Yellowstone Park, in which this sow was an unwilling participant. They had pioneered the use of radio collars for collecting data on bears and their travel patterns. She was caught and collared by the brothers and was labeled as Bear 1792. By the end of the Craighead study, all data and observations regarding the location and travel patterns of bears had ended at the same time the dump sites were closed. At the time of her capture and collaring, Bear 1792 was noted to be an older female with worn-out and broken teeth. When she was relocated, she was moved to an area only 18 miles away and easily found her way back. Now, Harry and Philip were enjoying their time in the park, and Philip had taken LSD that evening. They spent a good portion of the night wandering the geyser basin, chatting with people, and soaking in all that the park offered. By around 1 a.m., they were headed back to their clandestine campsite, using their flashlights to illuminate their way. The men were what rangers would call dirty campers. They left their food storage on the ground and didn't remove their food waste from their campsite. As they approached their tents, Harry paused and asked Philip if he'd heard something. The men craned their necks and heard chewing sounds coming from just a few yards away and near their tents. Harry lifted the beam from his flashlight in the direction of the noise, and it was immediately filled with the open jaws of a charging grizzly bear. The sow was upon the men before they could do anything but yell. Harry was knocked down with a swat of the bear's paws, and Philip turned to run. Within the first few steps of his retreat, Philip was sent tumbling down the hillside. He rolled and tumbled several yards, giving him separation from the bear's anger. The sow immediately turned back toward Harry and pounced on him in a frenzied attack. Philip could hear the bear growling and his friend howling in pain as he ran a short distance before turning around. He hadn't seen Harry, but was sure the bear had left. They had merely surprised her after all, and he was hopeful that she'd fled after sending the men running. Philip turned his head toward their camp and yelled, "Harry, did the bear leave yet?" His question was met with Harry's plea, "Help me, Crow." Harry's cries for his friend brought the sow back to finish what she'd started. Philip turned and stumbled toward the Old Faithful Inn about a quarter-mile away. Philip followed the lights on the building to its front doors and stumbled inside, breathing heavily and exhausted by about 1:10 a.m. He stammered that his friend had been attacked by a bear and needed help. The Rangers headed out to the campsite, but were uneasy about entering the timber in the dark of night. Calling out for Harry and hearing no reply, they returned, deciding to wait until morning. By sunrise, a handful of Rangers had returned to the men's campsite and quickly found Harry's remains. The grizzly had partially consumed his body, so they gathered his corpse to deliver to the coroner. They next set out snares and used road-killed carcasses as bait. The sow returned to the place where she left Harry's corpse and was snared, allowing Rangers to capture her. While restrained by the snare, she was shot and killed. The carcass of the 400-pound sow was taken to Montana State for analysis. The forensics team there found human hair on the sow's claws. Her stomach contained tinfoil and other camp debris that she'd consumed at the men's campsite. Following Harry's death, his family filed a lawsuit alleging negligence on the part of park management. They won their case in circuit court, but the Ninth Circuit overturned the circuit court's decision. The Supreme Court refused to take up the case, and Harry's family lost their farm, seeking justice. Their efforts did lead to the park refining policies on how bears were managed. Although the dump site supported the bears, it caused a very negative change in their behavior. For several years after their closure, bears were observed digging in dump sites that had long since been covered over. The grizzlies clearly remembered their former source of food and would regularly visit in hopes of finding more, even decades later. Due to mismanagement, grizzly bear populations bottomed out in 1990 at only 99 bears. It has taken almost 30 years for populations to reach their current levels of an estimated 750 bears. A book by the name of Engineering Eden, written by Jordan Fisher Smith, discusses this attack and its ramifications on modern environmental policy. I've linked to it in the pinned comment below, so check it out. I've also provided a link to the information revealed in the lawsuit filed by Harry's family. It paints a clear picture of the park's negligence. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Were park authorities negligent in their actions, or do park visitors assume the risk while in the park? Should people be involved in natural processes, or leave them alone? Should grizzly bear populations be managed through hunting or relocation? I'll be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Many Glaciers Campground in Glacier National Park, Montana. The mountains in this area are part of the Rocky Mountains and are generally around 8,000 feet high, with Mount Cleveland stretching up to 10,466 feet in elevation. The granite peaks retreat to valleys filled with timber of pine, fir, and spruce trees, mixed with stands of aspen, willow, and berry bushes. Common animals here include white-tailed deer, elk, and moose. Predators in this area include black bears, cougars, wolves, and grizzly bears. In the Many Glaciers area of the park, there had been a series of grizzly bear run-ins that were alarming. The plant life around the campground makes a favorable lowland forage site for sow bears raising cubs. The nutritious plants and abundant insects provide key nutrients for growing and adult bears. Boar grizzlies will often battle to include these kinds of areas in their territory to increase concentrations of sows for breeding purposes. Given the quality of bear food sources in this area, bear populations have been ticking up by about 30 bears each year. With governmental protections preventing hunting, the population has increased significantly in younger bears, which may be learning how to fit into the bear and human worlds. This learning curve involves younger bears raiding campsites and breaking into coolers and garbage cans. Habituation of human sources of food creates a dangerous and tenuous situation that presents a hazard to humans and bears alike. In the Many Glaciers area, 2 young grizzlies had been reported exhibiting aggressive behavior. One of the young bears had a particularly hostile attitude toward the presence of people. On July 7, 1976, William Schweighofer was sleeping in his tent at the lower campsite at Logging Lake. William was awakened in the middle of the night by the overwhelming mass of something pressing against him. As he reached his hands out of his sleeping bag, he could feel the round, large shape of a grizzly bear's rump pressing him down through his tent. William yelled and pushed against the bear's rump in an alarmed effort to scare it away. Instead of fleeing, the grizzly turned its jaws toward the man's voice and drove its teeth into the flesh of his arm. It used its bulk to hold him in place until it got a firm grip on his shoulder and repeatedly bit into his arm and shoulder as it did so. Once it got a hold of him, the bear began to drag William several yards while he was still in his sleeping bag and tent. After dragging William many yards, the bear lost interest and meandered off, leaving the man in pain and suffering from lacerations and puncture wounds to his arms and shoulder. Only a few weeks later, on August 15, 1976, 17-year-old Pam Sue Wise and her friend, Pam Benda, were having fun while hiking along the Ptarmigan Falls Trail, which led to Iceberg Lake. As they hiked along, they glanced behind them and noticed a huge grizzly bear was following them. The women immediately dropped their backpacks from their shoulders and pulled themselves up into a nearby tree. They were hoping the grizzly may have been interested in the contents of their backpacks, but watched as the bear approached the tree and stepped over their packs. It stood on its hind legs and scratched at the bark of the tree, trying to find a grip to climb up after them. It growled as it stared at them and raked its claws over the tree trunk. After a few futile attempts at climbing the tree, the grizzly turned and wandered off a short distance. Just when the ladies thought they were safe, the grizzly returned to the base of their tree. It clawed the tree and tried to pull itself up to get at the women one more time while staring at them and growling. Having been frustrated in its attempt to climb the tree, the grizzly wandered off for good this time. Eventually, the women were able to escape and reported the incident to rangers. A few weeks later, on September 9, 1976, Roscoe Black and Teresa Wadden were enjoying a hike to Stony Lake. While near the lake, 2 grizzly bears stormed out of the bushes along the trail. The most aggressive bear bit a big hole in Roscoe's calf and lacerated Teresa's arm, shoulder, and back before departing. Although their injuries were not life-threatening, they indicated a dangerous increase in violence and intensity in the 2 grizzlies' hostility toward people. On September 19, 1976, Karen Kuntz was relaxing while reading a book near the outlet of Fish Gap Lake. As she read, a rustle in the nearby bushes drew her attention away from her book. 2 huge grizzly bears stepped out of the bushes a mere 5 yards from Karen, to her horror. Knowing that running may elicit a predatory response from the bears, Karen pulled her jacket over her head and hid herself away, remaining still. She knew if she could see the bears approach, her fear would be obvious. The bears stalked toward her, sniffed her jacket, and investigated her scent. While the bears sniffed Karen, some noise from the lake drew their attention away from her. The 2 grizzlies' heads snapped toward the lake, where 2 of Karen's friends were fishing. The 2 men were 21-year-old Kerry Odell and 29-year-old Donald Brurud. Upon locking eyes with Brurud, the more aggressive grizzly dashed toward him. Brurud was near the shore of the lake and immediately swam for deeper water, with the bear chasing him. As you can imagine, it took very little time for the grizzly to catch up with the man. Brurud yelled and kicked at the bear with his fishing waders, hoping it would leave him alone. One of Brurud's kicks was caught by the bear, and it drove its teeth through his wader boot. The man curled his toes to avoid having them severed by the bear's teeth. The noise and resistance Brurud put up drove the bear back to shore and toward Odell. Carrie had watched the bear chase Brewitt into the water and made the best use of the time by climbing up a tree near the shore. Once the bear had abandoned its attempt to attack Brewitt, it focused its energy on Odell. The grizzly approached the tree that Carrie had climbed into and found a few lower limbs that it could lift itself up. The bear climbed the tree to the point it could claw Odell. Rather than staying in the tree as the bear tore him to ribbons, Carrie leapt from the tree and dashed into the lake in Brewitt's direction. The two men swam across the lake to avoid the shoreline near the grizzlies, where they met up with Karen. The trio immediately hiked out and reported the incident to park rangers. After receiving the second complaint for the same day regarding grizzlies in the campground, Ranger Reese was dispatched to investigate the reports. Upon arrival, he observed two grizzly bears that he could tell were 3 to 4 years of age and were each approximately 250 pounds in weight. They looked nearly identical, but behaved very differently. One of the bears was more docile, while the other was much more aggressive. He also noted that the sign indicated the campground's closure due to bear activity had been torn down by a bear. Agent Reese helped with the installation of 2 culvert traps at the lower end of the campground. The hope was to capture one of the bears and relocate it to a more remote section of the park. This would hopefully change the behavior of the remaining bear, in theory. The difference between theory and practice is what happened. At 7 p.m., Ranger Reese showed up at the Many Glaciers campground to brief its occupants on the recent bear activity. He gathered the 19 campers and discussed proper food and waste disposal and bear-aware behavior. Among the campers were 5 young women who were sharing a campsite. They were in site number 74 and included 21-year-old Mary Patricia Mahoney, who was sharing a tent with Barbara and Patricia Tucker. Also with them were Ellen Feynman and Jennifer Thompson, who were sharing a second tent. The women listened attentively to Ranger Reese's information and even asked several pertinent questions. They were already practicing bear safety guidelines and seemed to need confirmation that they were doing things correctly. After the informative meeting with Agent Reese, Feynman and Thompson decided to go to bed, while the other 3 women stayed up a little longer. A short while later, the other 3 women made their way to their tent, with Mary laying her sleeping bag nearest the tent door. At a little after 6:30 a.m., the women were jolted awake by the sound of a bear's claws being raked over the tent fabric near Mary. As the bear pawed the tent, it clawed Mary through the fabric. She began screaming from the pain and terror. Patricia was laying beside Mary and told her to be quiet and lay still, while her sister squeezed Mary's hand. Mary's screams sent the bear into a momentary retreat. Mary was beside herself and moaned while the women pulled themselves deep into their sleeping bags and covered their heads. She couldn't help but moan out of pain and fear, and this likely brought the grizzly bear back to near her location in the tent. Using Mary's moans to approximate her location through the tent fabric, the grizzly pounced on her and ruthlessly attacked her. Her muffled cries of pain echoed through the campground and woke Feynman and Thompson. Ellen and Jennifer had heard Mary's cries and the huffing and growling of the bear as it attacked her. They bolted from their tent, sprinted the short distance to their car, and climbed inside. As the 2 women watched, they honked the horn on their car while the grizzly mauled Mary until her cries ceased. Then it emerged from the tattered tent, dragging her sleeping bag. The bear carried off the sleeping bag just before Patricia and Barbara streaked toward the car. They joined the other 2 women in the car's safety and wondered aloud what had happened to Mary. The Tucker sisters explained to Patricia and Barbara that they had seen the bear dragging Mary's sleeping bag away, but didn't see what direction she had fled. They assumed she had made it to a tree and climbed it for safety, but couldn't confirm that hope. After all the honking and screaming, the other campground visitors began showing up to investigate the noise. Harry Mertz was one of the campers and immediately hurried toward the ranger's camper to report the bear activity. At 6:50 a.m., Ranger Reese was awakened by Mertz and hurriedly got dressed. Upon arriving at the scene, Reese met up with Stu Macy, an off-duty ranger from California. The 2 rangers decided to see if they could find Mary and headed off into the lodgepole pine stand nearby. Only 20 feet from Mary's tent, they found her empty sleeping bag spotted with her blood. They could see a drag trail leading away from the bag and slowly followed it toward Swift Current Creek. Along its path, they could see blood spatters and pieces of human flesh. A little further along the drag trail, they found Mary's T-shirt. It, too, was splotched with blood and tattered. Following the drag trail a little further led the rangers to a severed piece of her scalp, and then on to Mary's body. It was laying face down. A significant portion of her upper body had been consumed already, but there were no bears in sight. The rangers immediately cordoned off the area and ordered all campers to leave the campsite. The campground was vacated by all its occupants no later than 7:45 a.m. District Ranger Bob Frausen arrived at the campground as quickly as he could and brought with him his shotgun loaded with slugs. After Mary's body was found, he left to call the coroner and bring in more help for the rangers. Once Frausen returned, he met a chaotic scene with people yelling from two locations far apart from one another. Near Swift Current Creek was one group of people yelling about a bear, and to his left another voice could be heard, stating similar things. He knew where Mary's body was, so he headed toward it first. Frausen and another brave volunteer picked their way through the lodgepole pines. The silhouette of a grizzly suddenly emerged, and Bob fired a slug into its shoulder. As the bear spun to flee, a second grizzly came into view, and they both disappeared into the brush. Frausen gathered a few more men to his hunting party, and they began tracking the grizzlies. They searched gravel bars and executed sweeps on thick timber stands in the area where the bears were last seen. One of the hunters spotted a grizzly and fired at it, with Bob following up with one shot from his shotgun. The bear dropped to the ground with the impact of the bullets. As the men approached the dead bear, they could see there were two nearly identical bears in the same spot. Both bears had dark fur with silver-tipped guard hairs and weighed about 250 pounds each. The rangers determined that these two bears were likely littermates who had remained together as a hunting team after their mom had booted them to fatten up for the winter. With the bears now dead, the hunters returned to Mary's corpse. Once they arrived, they found Macy several feet high in a tree. He had been left to guard Mary's body when one of the grizzlies had returned and chased him up the tree. It was Macy's cries that Frausen had heard. Frausen was tasked with examining the bears' carcasses. After looking over their paws, he found blood and flesh in their claws. Lab analysis would confirm that one of the bears had human blood on its claws, while the other had bear blood on its claws. This meant that one of the grizzlies had located the grizzly initially wounded by Bob and had stood guard over it as it died. Now this is where this investigation takes a very confusing turn. The lab had opened up the stomach of each bear to examine the contents. Neither bear was found to have human flesh in its stomach. An examination of scat piles left around the area also showed a lack of any human tissue. Frausen was a very experienced ranger and offered an insightful explanation for this. He indicated that while he was investigating a predatory bear attack in Alaska, a bear that was known to have killed and eaten a man was examined. Upon performing a necropsy, the bear's gut was found to be devoid of any human remains. This bear was younger, just like the bears in this attack. A further examination of the attack site yielded human remains that had been regurgitated by the bear. It seems that younger bears do not have the proper enzymes to digest human flesh, or are so unfamiliar with it that they will vomit it after consumption at times. The timeline of the attack is as follows. Mary was attacked and killed at 6:45 a.m., and Ranger Reese was on site by 6:50 a.m. The bear or bears had killed Mary and eaten a portion of her upper torso by the time the rangers found her corpse. The bears had left, then returned to Mary's corpse, where they were killed no later than 8:30 a.m. the same day. Mary Patricia Mahoney died as a result of injuries sustained during this grizzly bear attack, and was only the third mauling victim in the park's history to that point. The prior two maulings were detailed on the Night of the Grizzlies episode on this channel. I've linked to it in the video article below if you would like to compare the two incidents. No other campers were injured during the attack on Mary. The campsite was closed until the investigation was concluded. All 5 women had followed all safety guidelines regarding food and waste. They had not attracted the bears to the campsite, and an explanation for this attack could not be concluded. While reviewing this attack, park authorities did acknowledge that some campsites were located near or on known bear travel routes. Changes were made to site locations, albeit too late to prevent Mary's death. After reviewing the details of this episode, I'm left with many questions for you, but will ask you only these. Why did the park officials wait to eliminate these 2 grizzly bears until Mary was killed? Does the fact that only one of the 2 grizzlies demonstrated aggression toward humans shatter the notion that cubs learn to predate on people from their mothers? Does the fact that cubs will vomit human remains due to lack of enzymes to digest human flesh indicate that they are not our natural predators? Did the rate at which the bears ate Mary's upper body surprise you? It sure surprised me. I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.